Margaret had always believed that hard work would be enough. She clutched the rejection letter in her trembling hands, reading the words for the 5th time that morning. The law firm she had dreamed of joining since college had turned her down, citing her lack of connections in the legal world. It wasn't her grades that failed her. She had graduated with honors from a modest state university. It wasn't her determination. She had worked 3 jobs to pay for law school. It was simply that she didn't come from the right family, didn't have the right last name, didn't move in the right circles. Standing outside the towering glass building that housed the most prestigious law firms in the city, Margaret felt smaller than she ever had in her 26 years of life. The autumn wind whipped through her brown hair as she watched well-dressed lawyers stride past her, their expensive shoes clicking against the marble steps. They belonged here in a way she never would. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother back in the small farming town where she grew up. "How did the interview go, honey?" The simple question brought tears to her eyes. Her parents had sacrificed so much for her education, working double shifts at the factory to help pay for her books and supplies. Her father had proudly told everyone in their neighborhood about his daughter, who was going to be a lawyer in the big city. Margaret walked slowly to the subway station, her interview outfit feeling like a costume that no longer fit. The navy blue blazer she had saved up to buy suddenly felt cheap and obvious. She had practiced her handshake in the mirror that morning, rehearsed answers to potential questions, and arrived 30 minutes early. None of it had mattered when the interviewing partner looked at her resume and asked, "Do we know your family? Your name doesn't sound familiar." The train ride back to her tiny apartment gave her time to think about her dwindling options. Her student loan payments would start soon, and the part-time job at the coffee shop barely covered her rent. She had applied to dozens of firms over the past 3 months, each rejection feeling like another door slamming shut. Some didn't even bother to respond to her applications. That evening, Margaret sat at her small kitchen table with her laptop open, scrolling through job listings that seemed increasingly desperate. Legal assistant positions that required 5 years of experience for entry-level pay, document review jobs in windowless basements, paralegal work that would keep her so busy she'd never have time to build the career she'd dreamed of. Her roommate Sarah came home from her job at the marketing agency, full of excitement about a new client presentation. "How did it go today?" Sarah asked, noticing Margaret's defeated expression. When Margaret explained what had happened, Sarah's face fell. "That's completely unfair. You're brilliant, Marg. You know more about the law than half the people I know who got hired at those fancy firms." But brilliance didn't seem to matter in a world where success was often determined by who your parents knew rather than how hard you worked. Margaret had grown up believing that America was a place where anyone could make it if they tried hard enough. Her parents had immigrated from Ireland with nothing but hope and determination, building a modest but honest life through sheer effort. She had thought the same principles would apply to her legal career. The next morning brought another rejection email, this one from a mid-sized firm she had really hoped would see her potential. The automated response thanked her for her interest and wished her luck in her future endeavors. It felt like being thanked for existing and then being asked to stop. Margaret decided to take a different approach. Instead of applying only to the big firms, she would look for smaller practices that might value hard work over connections. She spent the afternoon researching solo practitioners and small partnerships, looking for lawyers who had built their careers on merit rather than inheritance. One name kept appearing in her searches: William Chen. He ran a small but successful practice specializing in civil rights and employment law. His website was simple and professional, focusing on his track record of winning cases for ordinary people against powerful corporations. What caught Margaret's attention was his background. He had also come from a working-class family and had built his practice from nothing. Reading about William's cases, Margaret felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. Here was a lawyer who took on employers who discriminated against workers, who fought for people who couldn't afford expensive legal representation, who seemed to genuinely care about justice rather than just profit. His office was located in a modest building across town, far from the gleaming towers where she had been repeatedly rejected. Margaret spent the evening crafting a careful email to William's firm. Instead of using the generic cover letter she had been sending everywhere, she wrote specifically about why she wanted to work on civil rights cases. She mentioned her own experiences with discrimination, and her passion for helping people who felt powerless against larger institutions. She attached her resume but focused the email on her motivation rather than just her qualifications. After hitting send, Margaret felt nervous but hopeful. This felt different from her other applications. William Chen represented something she had started to believe didn't exist in the legal world, the possibility that someone might value her dedication and passion over her family connections. She went to bed that night thinking about her parents, who had taught her that dignity came from honest work and standing up for what was right. Maybe there was still a place in the legal profession for those values. Maybe there was still a chance that her dreams weren't completely out of reach. The autumn rain against her apartment window sounded almost musical as Margaret drifted off to sleep, holding on to the fragile hope that tomorrow might bring better news. She didn't know that her email was already sitting in William Chen's inbox, waiting to change both of their lives in ways neither could imagine. William Chen had arrived at his office earlier than usual that Tuesday morning, carrying his third cup of coffee and a stack of case files that seemed to grow heavier each day. His small practice was thriving, but success came with its own challenges. The cases were more complex, the clients more numerous, and the pressure to deliver results more intense than ever. At 34, William had built his reputation by taking on cases that other lawyers avoided: employment discrimination suits against major corporations, civil rights violations that made powerful people uncomfortable, and pro bono work for families who couldn't afford legal representation. His modest office in the Riverside district reflected his priorities: function over form, substance over style. His assistant, Elena, had been with him for 3 years and knew his habits well. She had learned to schedule his most challenging meetings for the morning when his energy was highest, and to keep his afternoon free for the detailed research work he preferred to do himself. When she arrived that morning, she found him already deep in preparation for a deposition scheduled for the following week. "You have 17 new emails," Elena announced, setting a fresh cup of coffee on his desk. 2 from existing clients, 3 from potential new cases, and the rest are the usual mix of spam and legal newsletters. William nodded absently, still focused on the employment contract he was reviewing. His current case involved a whistleblower who had been fired after reporting safety violations at a construction company. The evidence was strong, but the company had hired expensive lawyers who were making the process as difficult as possible. It wasn't until his lunch break that William finally opened his email. He quickly deleted the spam and newsletters, responded to his clients, and was about to close his laptop when Margaret's email caught his attention. The subject line was simple: application for associate position, passionate about civil rights law. What struck him immediately was the personal tone of her message. Most applications he received were formulaic and generic, clearly copied from template letters found online. Margaret's email was different. She wrote about her own experiences with discrimination during her job search, her family's immigrant background, and her genuine desire to help people who felt powerless against larger institutions. William found himself reading the email twice, then opening her resume. Her academic credentials were solid but not spectacular. No Ivy League schools or prestigious clerkships. What impressed him was the consistency of her choices. Every job, every volunteer position, every academic project seemed aimed at understanding and helping working-class people navigate complex systems. He noticed that she had worked in a factory during high school, the same type of manufacturing job his father had held for 30 years. She had volunteered at a legal aid clinic in law school, helping elderly clients understand Medicare changes. She had written her law review article about employment discrimination against first-generation college graduates. William leaned back in his chair, remembering his own struggles to break into the legal profession. He had faced similar rejections, similar questions about his background and connections. The difference was that he had eventually found a mentor who gave him a chance, an older civil rights lawyer who valued hard work over pedigree. Looking around his office at the case files stacked on every available surface, William realized he was at a crossroads. His practice was successful enough that he could afford to hire an associate, but he had been putting off the decision for months. The right person could help him take on more cases, serve more clients who needed help. The wrong person would drain his resources and compromise the quality of his work. Margaret's email arrived at a time when William was handling a particularly complex discrimination case that would benefit from additional research support. The case involved a group of immigrant workers who had been systematically underpaid and denied promotions at a large retail chain. The legal issues were intricate, requiring deep dives into employment law, immigration regulations, and corporate structure analysis. Elena knocked on his door, interrupting his thoughts. "That construction company's lawyers are here for the document review," she announced. "They brought 2 associates and a paralegal. They're setting up in the conference room." William nodded, but his mind was still on Margaret's application. There was something in her writing that reminded him of his younger self, the idealism tempered by real-world experience, the determination to prove that merit could triumph over privilege. He had been looking for someone who shared his values, not just someone who could handle the workload. After the document review session, which lasted 3 grueling hours, William returned to his office feeling drained but vindicated. The construction company's lawyers had tried every delaying tactic in the book, but the evidence was too strong to ignore. His client would likely receive a significant settlement, which would help him feed his family while recovering from the injuries that had prompted his whistleblowing in the first place. That evening, as William prepared to leave the office, he found himself thinking about the kind of lawyer he wanted to be and the kind of practice he wanted to build. He had always believed that the law should be accessible to everyone, not just those who could afford expensive representation. Hiring the right associate could help him expand that mission. He picked up his phone and dialed Margaret's number, which she had included in her email signature. It rang 3 times before she answered, her voice cautious and professional. "Hello, this is Margaret." "Hi, Margaret. This is William Chen. I received your email about the associate position at my firm." He could hear her sharp intake of breath, the moment of surprise and hope. "Yes, Mr. Chen, thank you so much for calling. I'd like to meet with you this week if you're available." "Are you free Thursday afternoon?" "Yes, absolutely. What time works best for you?" "How about 2 o'clock? My office is in the Riverside district." He gave her the address and basic directions from the nearest subway station. "I'll be there," Margaret said, her voice stronger now. "Thank you for this opportunity." After hanging up, William sat quietly in his office for a few minutes, watching the late afternoon sunlight filter through his windows. He thought about his father, who had never understood why his son wanted to be a lawyer instead of following a more practical career path. His father had eventually come to understand that William's work was just another form of the advocacy and fairness that had always been important to their family. Tomorrow, he would prepare questions for Margaret's interview, but tonight, he felt optimistic about the possibility of finding someone who could help him carry forward the work he had started. Thursday morning arrived with a crisp October chill that made Margaret second-guess her outfit choice for the 3rd time. She stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of her white blouse and smoothing the wrinkles from her black slacks. The navy blazer that had failed her at the prestigious downtown firm would have to do. It was the only professional jacket she owned. The subway ride to the Riverside district took 45 minutes, giving Margaret plenty of time to review what she knew about William Chen and his practice. She had spent the previous evening researching his cases, reading news articles about his victories, and studying his firm's website until she could recite it from memory. What impressed her most was his track record of actually winning cases for ordinary people against seemingly impossible odds. Elena greeted Margaret warmly when she arrived at the modest office building. The reception area was small but welcoming, with comfortable chairs and walls lined with framed newspaper clippings about William's most significant victories. Margaret noticed that many of the articles featured photos of his clients, factory workers, immigrants, single mothers, rather than William himself. "Mr. Chen will be with you in just a moment," Elena said, offering Margaret a cup of coffee. "He's finishing up a call with a client." Margaret accepted the coffee gratefully, using the few extra minutes to observe the office atmosphere. Through the open doors of other rooms, she could see stacks of legal documents, law books with worn spines, and bulletin boards covered with case timelines and evidence photos. It felt like a place where real work happened, where the law was used as a tool to solve actual problems rather than generate billable hours. William emerged from his office precisely at 2 o'clock, extending his hand with a genuine smile. He was shorter than Margaret had expected, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a slightly rumpled appearance that suggested he cared more about his work than his wardrobe. "Margaret, thank you for coming in," he said, leading her into his office. "Please have a seat." His office was organized chaos. Law books stacked on every surface, case files arranged in seemingly random piles, and a whiteboard covered with case timelines and legal theories. The walls displayed his law degree from a state university Margaret recognized as respectable, but not elite, along with photos of him with clients and community leaders. "Tell me about yourself," William began, settling into his chair behind a desk that had clearly seen years of heavy use. "I read your email and resume, but I'd like to hear your story in your own words." Margaret took a deep breath and began with her childhood in the farming community, her parents' sacrifices to support her education, and her growing awareness of how the legal system could either protect or exploit vulnerable people. She spoke about working in her family's small diner during high school, serving customers who struggled with medical debt, workplace injuries, and housing discrimination. "I saw how people would avoid dealing with legal problems because they assumed they couldn't afford help," Margaret said, "or they'd try to navigate the system alone and get overwhelmed by the complexity. I decided I wanted to be the kind of lawyer who could bridge that gap." William nodded thoughtfully. "What made you interested in civil rights law specifically?" Margaret hesitated, then decided to share the story she hadn't included in her email. "When I was a sophomore in college, my younger brother was denied a job at a local restaurant. The manager told him directly that they didn't hire people like him, meaning immigrants' kids. My brother was born here, he's completely bilingual, and he had excellent references, but he looked too much like our father." She paused, remembering the helpless anger she had felt. "We couldn't afford to hire a lawyer, and the local legal aid clinic was overwhelmed. My brother ended up taking a job at a gas station for half the pay. That's when I realized that having rights on paper doesn't mean much if you can't enforce them." William leaned forward, his expression serious. "How did that experience change your perspective on the law?" "It made me understand that legal knowledge without access is just academic theory," Margaret replied. "The most brilliant legal arguments in the world don't help if ordinary people can't afford to make them. I want to be part of changing that." For the next hour, William asked Margaret about her legal research skills, her experience with client communication, and her thoughts on specific areas of employment and civil rights law. He was impressed by her thoughtful answers and her ability to discuss complex legal concepts in plain language. "Let me tell you about what we do here," William said, gesturing toward the case files around his office. "We're not a traditional law firm. Most of our clients can't pay our full rates, so we do a lot of contingency work and pro bono cases. We take on corporations and government agencies that have significantly more resources than we do. The work is challenging and sometimes frustrating." Margaret nodded eagerly. "That's exactly the kind of work I want to do." "It's not glamorous," William warned. "You'll spend a lot of time in document review, researching obscure regulations and preparing for depositions that might get postponed 6 times. You'll work with clients who are scared, angry, or both. Some cases take years to resolve." "I understand," Margaret said. "I've worked in restaurants and retail. I know what it's like when people with power treat you as disposable. I want to help level that playing field." William asked her about a hypothetical employment discrimination case, walking through how she would approach the initial client interview, what evidence she would seek, and how she would structure the legal arguments. Margaret's answers demonstrated both solid legal reasoning and genuine empathy for the client's situation. "Do you have any questions for me?" William asked as the interview wound down. Margaret had prepared several questions, but one had been weighing on her mind since she walked into the office. "Can I ask why you decided to start your own practice instead of working for a larger firm?" William smiled, the first truly relaxed expression she had seen from him during the interview. "I worked for a big firm for 2 years after law school. I was good at the work, but I felt like I was using my legal training to help rich people get richer. I wanted to use the law to actually help people who needed it." He gestured toward the newspaper clippings on the walls. "Every case we win here makes a real difference in someone's life. Sometimes it's a financial settlement that helps a family avoid bankruptcy. Sometimes it's changing a company's policies so other workers won't face the same discrimination. That's worth more to me than any salary a big firm could offer." Margaret felt a surge of excitement and recognition. This was exactly the kind of practice she had dreamed of joining, one where the law was used as a tool for justice rather than just profit. "I'd like to offer you the position," William said. catching Margaret completely off guard. The starting salary isn't impressive, but there's room for growth as the practice expands. You'd start with research and document review, but I'd want you to take on increasing responsibility as you gain experience. Margaret felt her heart race. Are you serious? Completely serious. I think you'd be a good fit here. You understand what we're trying to accomplish, and you have the skills and motivation to help us do it better. For a moment, Margaret was too overwhelmed to speak. After months of rejections and diminishing hopes, William's offer felt almost too good to be true. Margaret's first month at William's firm passed in a whirlwind of case files, legal research, and client meetings that challenged everything she thought she knew about practicing law. The work was more intense and emotionally demanding than anything she had experienced in law school, but it was also exactly what she had hoped to find. Her first major assignment involved researching employment law precedents for the retail workers' discrimination case that William had mentioned during her interview. The case was more complex than she had initially understood. 15 immigrant workers had been systematically passed over for promotions, given fewer hours than their colleagues, and subjected to discriminatory comments from supervisors. The retail chain employed thousands of people across multiple states, making the potential impact of a successful lawsuit enormous. Margaret spent her days combing through employment records, interviewing witnesses, and researching similar cases from other jurisdictions. The work was meticulous and often tedious, but she found herself energized by the knowledge that every detail she uncovered could make the difference between justice and continued exploitation. William proved to be an excellent mentor, patient with her questions but demanding in his expectations. He had a gift for explaining complex legal strategies in simple terms, and he encouraged Margaret to think creatively about approaching problems from multiple angles. "The law is just a tool," he told her during one of their weekly case review meetings. "What matters is how skillfully you use it to protect your clients and hold powerful institutions accountable." Margaret's legal writing skills improved rapidly under William's guidance. He taught her to craft arguments that were both legally sound and emotionally compelling, to tell her clients' stories in ways that would resonate with judges and juries while staying firmly grounded in legal precedent. The retail workers' case became increasingly complicated as Margaret delved deeper into the company's employment practices. She discovered a pattern of discrimination that extended far beyond the original 15 plaintiffs. The company had been systematically underpaying immigrant workers, denying them overtime compensation, and creating hostile work environments designed to force them to quit. "This could be a class action," Margaret told William during one of their morning case reviews. "I've found evidence of similar treatment at stores in 3 other states." William studied the documents Margaret had compiled, his expression growing more serious as he read. "This is bigger than we initially thought. If we're going to pursue a class action, we'll need to be absolutely certain we can handle the scope and complexity." The decision to expand the case meant months of additional preparation. Margaret found herself working longer hours, traveling to interview potential plaintiffs in other cities and coordinating with local attorneys who could provide support in different jurisdictions. The work was exhausting but exhilarating. As winter settled over the city, Margaret began to feel like she was finally building the career she had always wanted. Her confidence grew with each successful research project, each well-written brief, each client meeting where she could provide useful guidance. William gradually gave her more responsibility, allowing her to take the lead on smaller cases while continuing to work on the expanding retail discrimination lawsuit. One particularly cold December morning, Margaret arrived at the office to find William on a conference call with attorneys from the retail chain's legal team. Their expensive law firm had finally recognized the strength of the case and was interested in discussing a settlement. Margaret listened from the doorway as William calmly outlined their demands, not just financial compensation for the affected workers, but comprehensive changes to the company's hiring, promotion, and training policies. After the call ended, William turned to Margaret with a tired but satisfied smile. "They're taking us seriously now. Your research made this possible." Margaret felt a surge of pride mixed with nervous excitement. The case that had started as her first major assignment was becoming a significant victory for workers' rights, with implications far beyond the original 15 plaintiffs. However, success brought new challenges. The retail chain's lawyers were among the most expensive and experienced in the country, and they were determined to minimize both the financial settlement and the scope of policy changes. What followed were months of intense negotiations, complicated legal maneuvers, and increasingly personal attacks on William's firm and their clients. Margaret watched William handle the pressure with grace and determination, never losing sight of the ultimate goal of protecting workers from discrimination. His example taught her that being a civil rights lawyer meant accepting that powerful opponents would try to wear you down through sheer attrition. The emotional toll of the work became apparent during client meetings. Margaret met with workers who had been subjected to years of discriminatory treatment, who had been afraid to complain because they needed their jobs to support their families. She listened to stories of supervisors who made cruel comments about immigrants, of promotion opportunities given to less qualified workers because of their ethnicity, of workplace cultures designed to make certain employees feel unwelcome and inferior. "It's important to remember why we do this work," William told Margaret after a particularly difficult client meeting. "These aren't just legal problems we're solving, they're human problems. Every case we win makes it a little harder for employers to exploit vulnerable workers." Margaret's personal life began to revolve entirely around the firm and its cases. She found herself thinking about legal strategies during her commute, researching precedents on weekends and staying late to prepare for depositions and hearings. Her friends from law school, who had taken positions at large corporate firms, seemed to inhabit a completely different professional universe. The financial stress of working for a small civil rights firm was real but manageable. Margaret's salary was modest, but her student loan payments were reasonable, and she took satisfaction in knowing that her work had meaningful impact. She lived simply, saving money when possible and finding free entertainment in the city's museums and parks. Spring brought a breakthrough in the retail workers' case. The company's legal team agreed to a substantial settlement that would provide significant compensation to the affected workers and require comprehensive changes to the company's employment practices. More importantly, the settlement included provisions for ongoing monitoring to ensure compliance with anti-discrimination laws. Margaret was in William's office when he received the call confirming the final settlement terms. After hanging up, he sat quietly for a moment before turning to her with a broad smile. "We did it," he said simply. 15 workers who were being systematically discriminated against will receive justice, and thousands of other employees will benefit from the policy changes we negotiated." Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes as the magnitude of what they had accomplished sank in. This was why she had wanted to become a lawyer, to be part of fights that actually mattered, to use her legal training to protect people who needed protection. But even as they celebrated this victory, Margaret knew that more challenges lay ahead. William's firm was gaining a reputation for taking on difficult cases and winning them, which meant that more clients with complex legal problems would be seeking their help. She was ready for whatever came next. The success of the retail workers' case brought unexpected consequences that neither Margaret nor William had fully anticipated. Within weeks of the settlement announcement, their small firm was flooded with inquiries from potential clients, media requests for interviews, and invitations to speak at legal conferences. What had been a manageable practice suddenly felt overwhelming. Margaret found herself fielding dozens of phone calls each day from workers who believed they had been discriminated against, immigrants facing workplace harassment, and families dealing with civil rights violations. Each story was unique, but the underlying patterns were depressingly familiar. Vulnerable people being exploited by those with more power. Legal problems too complex for individuals to navigate alone. "We need to expand," William told Margaret during one of their increasingly frequent late-night strategy sessions. "There are more people who need help than we can possibly serve with our current resources." The decision to grow the practice meant taking on additional attorneys and support staff, moving to a larger office and developing systems to handle the increased caseload. Margaret found herself involved in every aspect of the expansion, from interviewing potential hires to negotiating the lease for their new space. Their new office in a renovated warehouse building had 3 times the space of their previous location, with separate conference rooms for client meetings and a proper law library. Margaret got her own office for the first time, with windows overlooking a small park, where she could watch families playing during her brief lunch breaks. The first new attorney they hired was David Rodriguez, a recent law school graduate who had specifically sought them out after reading about the retail workers' case. Like Margaret, he came from a working-class background and was passionate about using the law to help ordinary people. His family had immigrated from El Salvador when he was a child, and he had first-hand experience with the challenges their clients faced. The second hire was Sarah Kim, an experienced litigator who had left a large corporate firm after becoming disillusioned with representing wealthy clients in disputes that seemed petty compared to the real injustices happening in the world. She brought sophisticated trial experience and connections throughout the legal community that would prove invaluable as they took on larger and more complex cases. Margaret found herself in an unexpected leadership role, helping to train the new attorneys and develop protocols for handling the increased volume of cases. William recognized her organizational skills and legal acumen by promoting her to senior associate, with a salary increase that finally allowed her to start paying down her student loans more aggressively. The firm's growing reputation brought them to the attention of a major civil rights organization that was looking for local counsel to support a federal lawsuit against the city's police department. The case involved a pattern of excessive force and discriminatory policing in predominantly immigrant neighborhoods. Margaret was assigned to lead the firm's work on the police lawsuit, the most significant case of her career so far. The legal issues were complex, involving constitutional law, municipal liability, and federal civil rights statutes. The opposing counsel represented not just the police department, but the city government, with unlimited resources and political pressure to minimize any settlement. Preparing for the case required Margaret to interview dozens of witnesses, many of whom were afraid to speak publicly about their experiences with police. She spent weeks in the affected neighborhoods, meeting with community leaders, attending residents' meetings, and building trust with people who had good reason to be suspicious of anyone connected to the legal system. The stories she heard were heartbreaking and infuriating. Families terrorized during raids that produced no arrests. Young men stopped and searched repeatedly for no reason other than their appearance. Elderly immigrants afraid to leave their homes because they feared harassment from officers who were supposed to protect them. This isn't just about individual officers, Margaret explained to William during one of their case review meetings. It's about a department culture that treats entire communities as suspect. The pattern of abuse goes back years, and it's been systematically ignored by city leadership. The police case consumed most of Margaret's time for the better part of a year. She worked with expert witnesses who analyzed arrest patterns and use of force statistics, coordinated with community organizations that documented police misconduct, and prepared legal briefs that challenged fundamental assumptions about police accountability. The depositions were particularly intense. Margaret found herself questioning police officers who either couldn't remember specific incidents or claimed their actions were justified by circumstances that seemed implausible. The city's attorneys tried every possible legal maneuver to limit the scope of discovery and prevent damaging information from becoming public. As the case progressed, Margaret began receiving subtle threats and intimidation attempts. Her car was vandalized in the courthouse parking garage. She received anonymous phone calls warning her to drop the case, and someone broke into the firm's offices one weekend without taking anything of obvious value. William insisted on hiring security for the office and advised all the attorneys to vary their daily routines. "This is what happens when you threaten powerful institutions," he told Margaret. "They'll try to scare you into backing down. We can't let them succeed." The pressure took a toll on Margaret's personal life. She worked 12-hour days regularly, spent weekends preparing for hearings and depositions, and found herself constantly thinking about the case even during the few hours she tried to relax. Her relationship with her college boyfriend, who worked in finance and couldn't understand her commitment to civil rights law, ended when he accused her of caring more about her clients than about him. "Maybe he's right," Margaret confided to Sarah during one of their occasional dinners together. "I do care more about stopping police abuse than I care about going to fancy restaurants or weekend getaways." Sarah, who had made similar sacrifices in her own career, understood completely. "The work we do matters more than most people realize. You're protecting people who have no other protection. That's worth some personal sacrifice." The breakthrough in the police case came when Margaret uncovered internal department emails that showed supervisors explicitly encouraging officers to target immigrant neighborhoods with aggressive enforcement tactics. The emails contained crude jokes about deportation and references to neighborhoods as hunting grounds for arrests. When the city's attorneys saw the emails, Their negotiating position collapsed almost immediately. What had been a complex federal lawsuit with uncertain outcomes became a clear case of institutional civil rights violations that would be nearly impossible to defend at trial. The settlement negotiations took months, but the final agreement was comprehensive. The city agreed to pay substantial damages to affected community members, implement new police training programs focused on constitutional policing, and submit to federal oversight of the police department's policies and practices. Margaret felt a deep sense of satisfaction when the settlement was announced, but she also recognized that legal victories were just the beginning of real change. Changing police culture would require ongoing vigilance and community engagement that extended far beyond the courthouse. The success of the police case established Margaret as one of the most effective civil rights attorneys in the city. She began receiving speaking invitations from law schools and civil rights organizations, and other attorneys sought her advice on complex civil rights litigation. But with recognition came new pressures and responsibilities that would test everything she had learned about practicing law in service of justice. 2 years after the police settlement, Margaret's life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. The firm now employed 12 attorneys and had offices in 3 cities, handling civil rights cases across the entire region. Margaret had been promoted to partner, with her name added to the firm's letterhead alongside Williams. But success brought complications that tested her resolve and forced her to confront difficult questions about the cost of fighting for justice. The firm's high profile meant they were constantly under scrutiny from political opponents, corporate adversaries, and media outlets that portrayed civil rights attorneys as troublemakers seeking quick financial settlements. Margaret's personal life remained largely subordinated to her professional commitments. She lived alone in a modest apartment near the office, her social circle consisting mainly of colleagues and client advocates. She had dated occasionally but found it difficult to maintain relationships with people who didn't understand the intensity and importance of her work. The case that would define the next phase of Margaret's career arrived on a rainy Thursday morning in March. Elena, who had been promoted to office manager as the firm expanded, knocked on Margaret's door with an expression of unusual concern. "There's a woman here who doesn't have an appointment," Elena said. "She's been waiting for 3 hours. She says she won't leave until someone talks to her." Margaret looked up from the employment discrimination brief she was reviewing. "Did she say what it's about?" "Sexual harassment and retaliation at Meridian Technologies. She says they destroyed her career when she reported her supervisor." Margaret knew Meridian Technologies by reputation, a defense contractor with government contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, known for aggressive litigation tactics and powerful political connections. Taking on Meridian would mean going up against one of the most well-funded and ruthless legal teams in the region. "Send her in," Margaret said, closing her laptop. The woman who entered Margaret's office was clearly exhausted and stressed. Linda Chen, no relation to William, was a 42-year-old engineer who had worked at Meridian for 8 years before her career was derailed by a supervisor's persistent sexual harassment and the company's retaliation when she complained. Linda's story was both familiar and unique. The harassment had started subtly, inappropriate comments about her appearance, unwanted touching disguised as friendly gestures, suggestions that her career advancement depended on her willingness to socialize with him outside work. When Linda politely but firmly rejected his advances, the harassment escalated to crude sexual comments and deliberate sabotage of her work projects. "I reported it to HR 3 times, Linda explained, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. "Each time they said they would investigate. Each time nothing happened except that my supervisor became more vindictive. My performance reviews went from excellent to unsatisfactory overnight. I was excluded from important meetings, given impossible deadlines, and blamed for problems I didn't create." Margaret listened carefully, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. Linda's account was detailed and consistent, with documentation that supported her claims. She had saved emails, recorded dates and times of incidents, and identified witnesses who could corroborate her story. "What finally made you decide to leave?" Margaret asked. "I didn't leave," Linda said bitterly. "They fired me. They claimed my work was unsatisfactory and that I was difficult to work with. After 8 years of excellent performance reviews and successful projects, they destroyed my reputation in the industry. I haven't been able to find another engineering job in 18 months. Margaret spent the rest of the morning reviewing Linda's documentation and researching Meridian Technologies' employment practices. What she found was troubling but not surprising, a pattern of complaints about sexual harassment and discrimination that had been consistently ignored or inadequately addressed by company management. After Linda left, Margaret discussed the case with William and Sarah. They all recognized that taking on Meridian would be a significant challenge, requiring substantial resources and exposing the firm to retaliation from a powerful corporation with extensive political connections. This is exactly the kind of case we should be taking, William argued. If we don't hold companies like Meridian accountable, who will? Sarah was more cautious. Meridian has unlimited resources and a track record of destroying attorneys who challenge them. We need to be absolutely certain we can handle whatever they throw at us. Margaret found herself torn between her commitment to helping victims of workplace discrimination and her awareness of the risks involved in challenging such a powerful opponent. The decision would affect not just Linda's case, but the future direction of the firm. After a week of research and consultation with other civil rights attorneys, Margaret decided to take Linda's case. The firm had grown large enough and established enough credibility to handle a high-stakes lawsuit against a major corporation. The first indication of what they were up against came within days of filing the lawsuit. Meridian's legal team filed motions challenging every aspect of the complaint, demanded extensive discovery that would cost the firm hundreds of thousands of dollars, and began what appeared to be a coordinated campaign to discredit both Linda and Margaret personally. Private investigators began showing up at Margaret's apartment building and office, asking neighbors and colleagues questions about her background and personal life. Anonymous complaints were filed against her with the State Bar Association, alleging various ethical violations that required time-consuming responses and formal hearings. They're trying to make this so expensive and time-consuming that we'll give up, Margaret explained to Linda during one of their strategy meetings. This is what they do to everyone who challenges them. Linda's resolve never wavered despite the mounting pressure. I won't let them destroy other women the way they destroyed me, she said. If we don't stop them, they'll keep doing this forever. The discovery phase of the case revealed the extent of Meridian's problematic workplace culture. Margaret's team uncovered emails showing that Linda's supervisor had harassed multiple female employees over several years, that HR complaints had been systematically ignored, and that the company had retaliated against other women who had reported sexual harassment. More disturbing was evidence that Meridian's executives were aware of the pattern of abuse but had chosen to protect perpetrators rather than victims. Internal documents showed that the company viewed sexual harassment complaints primarily as public relations problems to be managed rather than serious violations of employees' rights. As the case progressed toward trial, the pressure on Margaret intensified. Meridian's attorneys filed motion after motion, trying to prevent damaging evidence from being presented to a jury. They challenged Margaret's competence, questioned her motives, and suggested that she was exploiting Linda for financial gain. The personal attacks took their toll. Margaret found herself questioning whether she was strong enough to handle the sustained assault on her reputation and integrity. She had always known that civil rights work would be challenging, but the level of vindictiveness from Meridian's legal team was beyond anything she had previously experienced. The night before the trial was scheduled to begin, Margaret sat alone in her office, surrounded by boxes of evidence and legal briefs. She thought about Linda, whose career had been destroyed for the crime of refusing to tolerate sexual harassment. She thought about the other women at Meridian who were still enduring abuse because the company faced no consequences for enabling it. Despite her exhaustion and the stress of the impending trial, Margaret felt a familiar sense of purpose and determination. This was why she had become a lawyer, to stand up for people who couldn't protect themselves, to hold powerful institutions accountable for their actions. The federal courthouse was packed on the first day of Linda Chen's trial against Meridian Technologies. Margaret had never handled a case that attracted so much media attention, with reporters filling the gallery and camera crews waiting outside the building. The stakes were enormous, not just for Linda's personal vindication, but for establishing legal precedent that could protect countless other workers from retaliation. Margaret felt the weight of responsibility as she sat at the plaintiff's table, reviewing her opening statement one final time. Across the aisle, Meridian's legal team consisted of 6 attorneys from the most expensive law firm in the region, led by a partner who specialized in destroying employment discrimination cases before they could reach a jury. Judge Patricia Williams, a respected federal judge with 20 years of experience, called the court to order with an expression that suggested she was well aware of the case's significance. Margaret had appeared before Judge Williams several times and respected her commitment to ensuring fair proceedings regardless of the parties' relative resources. "Ms. O'Brien," Judge Williams said, "you may present your opening statement." Margaret stood and walked to the jury box, making eye contact with each of the 12 jurors who would decide Linda's fate. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, she found herself speaking from the heart rather than from her carefully crafted notes. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this case is about a simple principle, that no one should have to choose between their career and their dignity. Linda Chen was an outstanding engineer who loved her work and believed that hard work and talent would be enough to succeed. She was wrong, because her supervisor decided that her value as an employee depended on her willingness to submit to sexual harassment." Margaret outlined Linda's story chronologically, from her initial hiring and excellent performance reviews to the escalating harassment and ultimate retaliation. She explained how Meridian's HR department had ignored multiple complaints and how the company had systematically destroyed Linda's career when she refused to stay silent. The evidence will show that Meridian Technologies enabled and protected a serial sexual harasser because they valued his contributions more than the safety and dignity of female employees, Margaret continued. They will claim that Linda was fired for poor performance, but their own documents prove that she was targeted for destruction because she dared to complain about sexual harassment. Meridian's lead attorney, James Morrison, presented a very different narrative in his opening statement. He portrayed Linda as a disgruntled employee who had fabricated harassment claims to cover up her own professional failures. According to Morrison, Linda's termination was the result of legitimate performance issues that had nothing to do with any alleged harassment. The plaintiff wants you to believe that Meridian Technologies, a company with thousands of employees and a sterling reputation, would destroy someone's career over false sexual harassment allegations, Morrison argued. The evidence will show that Ms. Chen was terminated for cause after a pattern of poor performance and difficult behavior that made her impossible to work with. The trial that followed was intense and emotionally draining. Margaret presented a methodical case built on internal company documents, email chains showing the harassment, and testimony from witnesses who had observed the discriminatory treatment. Linda's testimony was particularly powerful. She spoke calmly and clearly about the harassment she had endured, never losing her composure despite aggressive cross-examination from Morrison. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence was a series of emails between Linda's supervisor and other male employees containing crude sexual comments about female colleagues. The emails had been preserved on the company's servers despite efforts to delete them, and they painted a clear picture of a workplace culture that treated women as objects rather than professionals. Meridian's defense strategy relied heavily on attacking Linda's credibility and performance record. They presented testimony from supervisors who claimed Linda had been difficult to work with, and they introduced performance reviews that had been retroactively altered to make her seem less competent than she actually was. The most challenging moment came when Morrison cross-examined Linda about her decision to stay at Meridian for months after the harassment began. "If the harassment was really as severe as you claim," Morrison asked, "why didn't you quit immediately?" Margaret watched Linda compose herself before answering. "Because I needed my job to pay my mortgage and support my family. Because I believed that reporting the harassment would make it stop. Because I thought that 8 years of excellent work would count for something. I was wrong about all of those things, but that doesn't make the harassment any less real." Margaret's closing argument focused on the broader implications of the case. "This trial is about more than Linda Chen," she told the jury. "It's about whether we're willing to accept a workplace culture where women have to endure sexual harassment as the price of employment. It's about whether powerful corporations can destroy people's lives when they complain about illegal treatment." She walked the jury through the evidence methodically, showing how Meridian's own documents contradicted their claims about Linda's performance and proved the pattern of retaliation. They want you to believe that it's just a coincidence that Linda's performance reviews went from excellent to poor immediately after she complained about sexual harassment. They want you to believe that it's just a coincidence that she was excluded from meetings and given impossible assignments right after filing HR complaints. Morrison's closing argument painted Linda as an opportunist seeking a financial windfall from a fabricated claim. He argued that employment disputes were complex and that companies had the right to make personnel decisions based on legitimate business reasons. The jury deliberated for 3 days, a length of time that left Margaret anxious about the outcome. She knew that corporate defendants often won employment cases because juries were reluctant to award large damages against businesses, especially when the legal issues were complex. When the jury returned with their verdict, Margaret felt her heart racing as the foreman stood to announce their decision. "We find in favor of the plaintiff on all counts," he said. "We award compensatory damages in the amount of $800,000 and punitive damages in the amount of $2.2 million. The courtroom erupted as Margaret turned to embrace Linda, who was crying tears of relief and vindication. The monetary award was substantial, but more important was the jury's clear message that sexual harassment and retaliation would not be tolerated. As Margaret gathered her papers and prepared to leave the courthouse, she felt a profound sense of satisfaction and exhaustion. The case had taken 2 years of her life and had subjected her to personal attacks and professional challenges that had tested her commitment to civil rights law. But looking at Linda's face as she spoke to reporters outside the courthouse, Margaret knew that the struggle had been worth it. Linda's courage in pursuing the case despite enormous pressure would protect other women from experiencing the same discrimination and retaliation. William found Margaret in her office that evening, still processing the magnitude of what they had accomplished. "You did something extraordinary today," he said. "You proved that ordinary people can still get justice when they're willing to fight for it." Margaret nodded, thinking about all the cases that had led to this moment. The retail workers who had been systematically discriminated against, the communities terrorized by police abuse, the individual clients who had trusted her firm to fight for justice when no one else would. "This is why we do this work," she said quietly, "not for the money or the recognition, but because someone has to stand up for people who can't protect themselves." As Margaret finally prepared to leave the office that night, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that desperate afternoon, when she had been rejected by yet another prestigious law firm. She had found her purpose in serving clients who needed protection from powerful institutions, and she had discovered that the most meaningful victories came not from impressing judges or colleagues, but from changing real people's lives for the better. The phone was already ringing with calls from potential new clients who had heard about the Meridian verdict. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, and new opportunities to use the law as a tool for justice. Margaret was ready for whatever came next.